So, welcome. This is the first in our second subsection of the UX design life cycle. I host weekly webinars covering the fundamentals of UX design. And the last 8 weeks or so, I have really gone into depth covering all of the things having to do with user experience research. And so now I'm super excited because I'm ready to start talking about the actual design part of UX design, which is, I think, most people's favorite part of UX. It's really, really fun. Next week, I'll be covering sketching, and we'll be getting into, more like how to workshopping and creating wireframes and prototypes and that sort of thing. But today is really just an overview of all of those sections that are going to be happening in the weeks to come. So I'm very, very excited. I did want to just give a quick plug to anyone that might be watching this after the fact. I do have a Patreon. If you want to make sure that you have access to all these webinars every single week, you can join for just $2 a month. Most of the time, people are able to get free tickets. I do always offer free tickets because I want this to be accessible information to everyone. But yeah, it is there if you just want to support me or if you want to get extra content or anything like that. So today we'll be covering two main points. I want to talk about the nature of UX design, and I also want to talk about bottom-up versus top-down design. Can I access past webinars? I do have the majority of the past webinars on YouTube, so I will send out a link via email after this webinar, and I'll make sure that you have access to this recording, and then you can also just search my YouTube channel for past webinars as well. So we are in the UX design lifecycle, and we have, for the past 8 weeks or so, covered the understand needs category, which is all about understanding user work and needs. We've covered how to interview users, how to go to a site and visit with people that you might be potentially creating an application for. And then we've moved into, how do you create journey maps? What are personas? Like all those research elements that you hear a lot about when it comes to UX research. But now we're going to move into the designing solution phase. And that's where you're actually going to start putting pencil to paper and creating some design concepts. So that is the part in the UX lifecycle. Oh, and just to kind of go over the whole thing again, I know I go over this very briefly every time, but I think it's important to just talk about where we're going to go in the future. So we'll go through design solutions for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll move into prototyping candidates. And that's going to help us realize some design alternatives that we might come up with that we might have not come up with in the initial design phase. Then after you prototype your candidates and you figure out which solutions are best, you're going to want to evaluate those solutions using users. You want to verify that those designs are good. You want to refine what is not good about them. And then you repeat that process all over again with going back to re-understanding your users, seeing what's changed over time, and then going through the cycle again. So it's a very iterative process, and that's really a fundamental part of working in an agile environment as well, which is the perspective that I take with UX design in all of these webinars and things. So I did want to briefly cover, so within the UX design lifecycle, specifically talking about the design concepts piece, the second piece that we're in now, past understanding user needs, we have a couple of different areas that we will be covering. So today we're going to really be focusing on design mindset, so the nature of UX design and also the kind of top-down versus bottom-up approaches you can take in design. Next week, we'll be covering generative design. So I actually want to go over how to sketch and how to sketch well and efficiently in a way that's going to benefit you. Oh, and I see that there's someone else that's waiting in the waiting room. I'm going to remove this waiting room thing. I hate that it automatically makes people do that. But I want to mute participants on entry and not, I want to disable the waiting room so that people can actually get in. Okay, anyway, sorry. So I want to go over sketching next week, and then the week after that we'll go over mental models and conceptual design. We want to design for the ecology or the environment that the product or system will be in. We want to design the interaction, and we also want to design for emotional impact. So these are all of the different pieces that we'll be covering in the next couple of weeks. I haven't quite decided if I'm going to break it up exactly like this, but it will be either broken up like this per week, or it'll be very close. I've already started working on the material for all of these webinars. So I wanted to briefly cover that we have a very interdisciplinary nature in the UX design space. We are experts in a lot of different areas when we are UX designers. We are expected to have expertise in problem solving, in analyzing problems and reasoning. We also are supposed to take into consideration the constraints that we are given and optimize our product within those constraints. We also want to be experts in product development. We want to make sure that we're staying within budget, we're keeping on time, we're delivering our product in a timely fashion, and we're staying within our constraints of, you know, maybe time or budget and that sort of thing. We also want to be good at estimating the level of effort that it takes to complete these tasks so that our client knows when they can expect things to be done. So that's kind of that product development piece you see here. We also want to be experts in the work domain that we are studying. So a lot of that has, through the last couple of weeks when I've been talking about design research, that hopefully has opened your eyes to that work domain that you're studying for whatever application that you're working on, through talking to users, through research, your own research online, or using other resources. Hopefully that UX research piece, by doing UX research, you become an expert in the work domain that you are creating your application or your system for. You also want to be an expert in design platforms. So you also want to be experts in particular technologies. We're experts in a lot of things as UX designers. It's important for us to know all of these things because it's going to help us do the best job possible and create a great product. So it sounds like a lot, but hopefully as I'm explaining, you can kind of understand why I've picked all of these categories, because they are fundamentally important for actually creating the best product possible for our users. And you would hope as a user of some of these apps that the designers did have a good understanding of all of the things I've listed here. So you want to be an expert in particular technologies, right? So you want to understand how people use iPhones, iOS, implications and constraints and different functionality, as well as Android, Apple Watch, iPad, tablets in general, websites, all of these different, whatever technology you are going to be creating for, you want to be an expert in how that technology is going to interact with your design. You also probably want to stay up to date on art, culture, liberal arts, and social sciences, because a lot of that can also impact your work. So moving forward, I wanted to cover briefly how we define design. So this is kind of the core of the whole UX, what is the point message. I wanted to mention that we can define design as a noun, and it's also defined as a verb. So actually, I've titled this so wrong. Why did I title it design as a noun? Anyway, sorry for that error. But yes, so in this flow chart, we actually have design as an act of creation and design as a plan or structure of product, which is a noun. And the creation, the actual design as a verb, creating something, results in that structure of a product, which is the noun. And those are instantiated into products when implemented, and we have, you know, obviously our results are implementations. So those are kind of the definitions of design. And next I want to cover, if we consider design a verb, we can view this in two perspectives: the fundamental nature of activities involved, or the increasing fidelity or increasing depth of detail of outputs within each subsequent iteration of this activity. So kind of two ways to talk about design as a verb here. This chart, we're covering that first perspective. So the design box is this SUBLIFECYCLE, which follows the following fundamental activities. These activities include considering inputs and synthesizing them, which is an active analysis, ideation to facilitate the genesis of design proposals or ideas, which is the act of creation, and then capturing these ideas in the form of sketches, which is the act of lowest fidelity prototyping. You're literally taking a pencil and paper and just sketching a ton of different ideas. Then you also want to critique those ideas, so putting them through the process of evaluating the trade-offs and the different benefits and drawbacks of each design, and the feasibility of the design proposals you have sketched, which is the act of evaluation. There are at least 3 categories of human needs that must be met by design. The first is ecological needs to be able to participate and thrive in the context of the place it is being used. The next is interaction, which just means that it needs to be able to perform the required tasks in the ecology of the work domain. And emotional needs to be emotionally and culturally satisfied and enriched as the person uses the product, including the need to be able to form long-term emotional relationships with the product, which we call meaningfulness. So if you can achieve all 3 of these things with your design, you're going to have a very powerful product. Meeting ecological needs is a prerequisite for meeting any other type of needs and is the foundation for our pyramid. Similarly, a design cannot satisfy a user's emotional needs without first meeting the ecological and interaction needs. So we have a lot of flowcharts today, I'm gonna be honest. There are at least 3 categories of human needs that must be met by a design. There's ecological, which is that it needs to be able to participate and thrive in the context of the place it is being used. Interaction means that it needs to be able to perform the required tasks in the ecology of the work domain. And emotional, it needs to be emotionally and culturally satisfied and enriched as they use the product, including the need to be able to form long-term emotional relationships with the product, which we call meaningfulness. So if you look at this chart, this is all of the different life cycle activities in design we will be covering in detail during this webinar. So the usage research requirements and modeling, that's something we've been covering for the past 8 weeks. That's really just the idea of taking the data that you have on your users and figuring out how to kind of analyze that data. Then you're going to create your actual design goals. In the case of Agile UX, you are likely going to have user stories built up in a backlog, which all have their own individual design ideas, and that's going to facilitate the work that you need to do, the designs you need to create to solve those problems that are outlined in your user stories. A user story, if you haven't been to a bunch of our webinars, is just, I covered this last time, but it is just a concise statement that says, that states a user need and asks for a solution to that need. That is the work of the designer to solve. So once you have your design goals, you can start sketching or doing generative design. Then you'll move into conceptual design, intermediate design, and detailed design. I'll cover those definitions just briefly here. So generative design means you're going to consider multiple alternative ideas for features, capabilities, and conceptual designs. In the conceptual design phase, you're going to consider candidates for ecology, interaction, and emotion. And then in the intermediate and detailed design phases, you're going to flesh out those designs and really get into detail with what those designs are going to look like. Then you'll move into design refinement. You'll release the version, or you'll hand off your design to the developers or software engineers, as I sometimes shorten it to SE in my presentations. And then you'll actually make sure that the UX matches up with what the developers have done and kind of work with the developers to create your projects. And that is my life cycle activities and design piece. I see your question. I will get to it at the end. Generative design, design creation. Okay, let me take a water break. So I've included kind of a quick little flow chart at the top of each of these slides. And then I've also included some examples at the bottom so that hopefully you get a good idea of what each of these steps entail. So generative design is an approach to design creation involving ideation, sketching, and critiquing in a tightly coupled but not necessarily structured iterative loop for exploring design ideas. So what you're going to want to do when you sketch, this is really just the definition of sketching, in my opinion, which is so important to know and be an expert in as a designer, because it is the beginning stage for everything that's going to come after the fact. You want to take this time to actually explore a lot of different ideas, and sketching is important for this. If you jump right into high fidelity designs, you're going to leave a lot of creativity on the table. You're not going to explore all of the options that you might have otherwise. And by taking pencil to paper instead of starting out in the computer, you are free to doodle and figure out things on paper in a very quick, rough way. You're not concerned too much with polish, although I will show you a way to do sketching in a way that is still going to be clean enough that you can actually show to your client and show to developers or other people on your team in a way that they're going to understand. But just because I think that it's important or nice to have clean sketches, that doesn't necessarily mean they need to take a long time. So anyway, those are my 2 cents on sketching. We'll get more into that in the next webinar, but yeah, I feel very strongly about sketching. I think it's so, so important. But yeah, again, so when you're doing this generative process, you're going to generate a bunch of different ideas. You're going to capture those ideas on paper. You're going to get those critiqued. Maybe you're just critiquing them yourself. If you're a team of one, if you're the only UX designer, maybe you're getting critique from other team members, other designers in your space, and evaluating those ideas that you've put on paper. Then you're going to want to actually analyze the inputs and figure out, which of your sketches are best that you're going to take into the next phase. So you should be starting out with a ton of sketches and then kind of narrowing down as we're going down this list of steps in the design process. You start out with a ton of ideas and then you're kind of modifying the best ones as you go along until you get to really the best design possible that you're going to hand off to the developer. So conceptual design. This figure shows the early part of the conceptual design phase, where you take the sketches that you created in the generative design phase and start working on some early wireframes. You might have thrown away some of the sketches that you did in the generative phase and just kept the best ones. Wireframes are quick, simple sketches made of lines, arcs, vertices, and text, and really simple graphics. So you're going to take these design concepts per device in your ecology. Say you're doing something that requires both a website and a mobile app. You're going to want to cover both of those in your wireframes. You might use storyboards to display how your products are going to work within your work environment, and create some early prototypes to kind of simulate the interactions that are going to take place. And you also want to, again, get those critiqued, get feedback from others, and analyze them yourself to make sure that you're going down the right path at this point. And these are some examples at the bottom. It's a lot of usually gray boxes and just placeholders. You might use some icons and things like that, but it's really just trying to get down the fundamentals of your design before we get too in deep with things like color and level of graphical detail and that sort of thing. Next, you have your intermediate design iteration. I've also heard this referred to as high fidelity mockups, and it is usually the activity that takes the longest. The goal is to work out the details to create logical flows of navigational structure and screen designs for interaction, and flesh out themes for emotional impact. Prototypes are created through the use of click-through mockups. You might have used something like Envision in the past. That's a great tool for prototyping. Illustrated scenarios and mood boards. Emotional impact issues such as visual design styles, iconography, tone, typography, animation frameworks, and auditory styles are all fleshed out. So it is this phase in the design process where you will usually have someone like a visual designer. If you have someone like a visual designer on your team, that's the part where they're going to step in and start working on the design. Before this, every team's laid out differently, and there are a lot of different ways that teams kind of handle tasks and jobs. But typically you'll have, if you have a very big team, you might have a UX researcher taking on the parts that we've talked about in the previous weeks, where they're interviewing users and that sort of thing. Then once you get to this phase where you're creating wireframes and things, it's more of a UX designer's job. And then you might actually have a visual designer take on something like this, where they're actually starting to illustrate and use color and that sort of thing. So then we're going to want to go into the detailed design iteration phase. Although first, let me make sure I covered everything. So you're going to want to, mature your design concepts and expansion in details. You want to illustrate your scenarios using storyboards, wireframes, mood boards, and you also want to make sure you're getting feedback in this phase with key stakeholders. You don't want to go further than this without making sure your stakeholders have seen your design for sure, and getting some good feedback and making sure you're going in the right direction. Not every stakeholder I've interacted with really appreciates the steps before this, kind of the sketches and the low-level prototypes. You might, when I showcase how I create these, I will show you a way to do it so that it is presentable to show to someone that's a stakeholder. But there may be times where they don't want to see all of this process work, and they just want to see this phase of the process where they can actually see that it looks like an actual mobile app or website or whatever it is. And this is the most easily understood by stakeholders because it looks like an app. So then you're going to get into the detailed design iteration phase. You're going to get specific about the way that your designs look. You're going to finalize screen and layout details, the look and feel of your product. All user interface elements are now represented, now with a very specific and detailed graphical look and feel. This is the time for things to be pixel perfect. Colors, sizes, shapes, fonts, spacing, and location. You'll need to create assets and layout specifications for the developers. An asset, if you don't know, is a visual element along with all of its defining characteristics as expressed in style definitions such as cascading style sheets or CSS. For a website, they can be photographs, icons, and more. So an asset could be like a stock photo or an icon or whatever. The visual designer will cast all of this to be consistent with the company branding, style guides, and best practices in visual design. It is most crucial to get feedback from developers in this phase in order to get information about feasibility, platform constraints, and other necessary changes before an official handoff. So you're actually going to create visual comps, high fidelity prototypes, and you're going to want to get evaluation with users as well in this phase before we actually hand it off to the developers. So we can use platforms like InVision or other prototyping platforms to actually put our mockups in front of actual real users and get feedback that way. So I want to briefly cover the funnel model of Agile UX and how it fits in this scenario. Mark, thank you so much for your questions. I will cover them at the end, I promise. How does the design creation sub-lifecycle fit into the Agile UX funnel? Each slice of functionality in the funnel entails an iteration of the steps we've covered so far in the presentation. So work in the early funnel addresses a more global view of the product or system and therefore has a large system-wide scope. In the narrow end of the funnel, we focus on smaller slices of functionality, further constrained by design decisions already made in previous slices. So in this beginning part of the funnel, we're really focusing on pretty global changes, but in the late funnel, we've already made a lot of the design decisions that we need to make in terms of style, color, that sort of thing, and the patterns we have created within our app. So it gets a little bit more narrow in focus, and we're really focusing on the details in the smaller funnel slices. So all of my workshops so far have covered a bottom-up process when it comes to design. And what I mean by that is that you, when you're designing using a bottom-up approach, you're immersing yourself in the work practice with the objective of designing a solution based on gathered data, investigations, and the analysis of users in the existing work practice. And I want to talk about how the design creation sub-life cycle fits into the Agile UX funnel. Wait. No, I already covered that. Sorry, my notes are copied and pasted. Oh my gosh, this presentation is just a mess, isn't it? Um, sorry, I shouldn't say that. I feel like this is helpful information, but I didn't copy my notes right. But I wanted to just show this really small flow chart that covers the definition of bottom-up design. And basically, when you're doing the bottom-up approach to design, you're first taking the current work practice with problems, breakdowns, and inefficiencies, and you're trying to move that into a work practice that has no problems, that is enhanced by this newly designed system, which realistically, you're always going to have problems with the design, which is why that design is an iterative process, and you're always seeking to improve it, and that's why a website or application is never complete. But nevertheless, that is the goal, is to have a perfect application to solve the problems in your work practice. The top-down approach to design, it works a little bit differently. So the bottom-up design is less likely to lead to innovative possibilities. It's about changes that can accommodate the existing system, and there's no goal in the bottom-up design to see if a practice should or could be changed at a fundamental level. That's where you might want to consider doing top-down design. So top-down approaches to design have you start with an abstract description of work activities, stripped of information about existing work practices. The goal is to work towards a best design solution independent of current perspectives and biases. This enhances and supports the fundamental nature of the work, irrespective of current practices, preferences, traditions, or constraints. So this is where true innovation has a chance to shine. When you're focusing too much on just modifying and perfecting existing processes, you might not be considering things that are out of the box that you might have considered if you had not done this bottom-up approach and instead done this top-down approach. So this is better illustrated using this flow chart. So in bottom-up design, usage research is to analyze and model the existing work practice to improve it. And in top-down design, usage research is to formulate and understand the abstract conceptualization of underlying essentials of the work. So you have the bottom-up approach here, which I read earlier and I had before. This is the same thing as this part right here. So your goal when you're doing bottom-up approaches is to enhance and support the existing way of doing work. You're paying close attention to what users are saying and doing in the current application or whatever the current work practice looks like. In the top-down approach, you're not really talking to users first. You're instead taking the abstract idea. Maybe you're told, you know, hey, design a new ride-sharing app, for example. If you were taking the bottom-up approach, you would want to talk to users of the current ride-sharing app. You'd want to see where the problems lie, what they think, what the usage research and data and analytics tell us about the way that people use it. And you want to kind of refine and perfect what is already going on. When you're doing top-down, you're keeping things at a very abstract level. So you're envisioning the work activity without biases and constraints, and you're creating new designs without all of the constraints that might be put into your head if you did bottom-up design. And so it creates potential new ways of doing work. So that's kind of the difference in focus when you're thinking in one mindset versus another. I think that the best way to design is probably using some combination of both. Ideally, you would want design solutions that are both using the bottom up and the top down approach, so that you are getting all of the feedback from your users and you're designing in a way that fits your users, but then you're also taking the time to think out of the box and create designs that might be something that no one has thought of before. So I want to go a little bit over what an abstract work activity is. So an abstract work activity is a description of the fundamental nature of a work activity in a particular domain, stripping to its essentials. The essence of work that in that domain involves not only the central work roles, well, sorry, I need to read that sentence again. It is the essence of work in that domain involving only the central work roles, the simplest description without variations and modifications due to biases and constraints due to historical, business, political, or other influences. An abstract work activity can be instantiated into multiple different work practices. Each is one solution to the abstract work activity problem, one way of doing the work. It is how the work gets done in a given concrete context. So that's kind of the difference between bottom up and top down. I thought those were important mindsets to cover. But now we'll get into some of your questions. And I will stop the recording.